we're going to cover today. We're going to cover what is imposter syndrome, where it comes from, what causes it. And I've put a question in there called friend or foe, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment or later on in the workshop. We've got techniques for you that I will cover that will help you to get started, at least in a more general way, around imposter syndrome. As I mentioned, there's a free guide. You'll receive the recording after this call, and I've included a link to book a call. So if you've got a specific situation that has been worrying you, because what I found from working with my clients is that no two situations are identical. There might be some similarities, but we're all very unique, and our own version of imposter syndrome or self-doubt can be very unique to us. Oh, got something in the chat. Yeah, here too, snow. Yeah, it's Christmas already. Anyway, so I've got two numbers here, and if you feel you fancy a guess, you like a bit of a quiz, can you put in the chat what you think 70% means and what you think 84% means? So just have a guess. Do those numbers mean anything to you? And I will reveal all in a second. So, we've got a question mark. So 70% means that's the number of people in their professional lives who suffer with imposter syndrome each year. So sometimes I've seen numbers for 75% actually, but if we go with that 70%, that's quite a large number of people that are feeling self-doubt, feeling a bit worried, that are going through symptoms of imposter syndrome. And 84% are the number of business owners that suffer with imposter syndrome. So you can have imposter syndrome whether you're, for example, a parent returning to work, whether you are currently in a leadership role, and as I mentioned, there's been a positive change for you, a new promotion, a new team, or whether you're working in a cross-functional work stream that might feel a bit alien to you. You might think, well, how do I interact with different people that have different priorities? It could be, as I mentioned, a restructure. So what I want to say is it's very, very common. Now, imposter syndrome was first identified in the 1970s, but at that time, the studies were only conducted with high achieving women. So it was a very specific cohort of people that was studied at that time. And what we know since the 1970s is that it affects males, females, however you identify, alike. I've worked with males, I've worked with females who are across different levels of the organisation, managers, going back to work, returning after a break, post-redundancy, senior directors, global senior directors, C-suite executives. It can happen at different times. And once you've experienced it once, and it does start to come back, you will be able to put words to it, to recognise it and work through it. Now, one of the questions I had was around, well, how does it affect women in leadership? Well, as I mentioned, the study was first conducted amongst women, so it wasn't entirely a comprehensive study. But some of the thoughts and some of the papers written about this seem to suggest that there are nuances for women. Now, I'm not sure how true they hold today. This is just what I've read up from some of the papers and some of the subsequent studies that have been published. Sometimes there can be societal expectations of the role that women have. And sometimes when we're going into a leadership role and perhaps having to dial into assertiveness, different sides of our personalities to deal with the complexities and the busyness of corporate life, sometimes that can fly in the face of what traditionally is thought of as a nurturing and caregiving role. Now, for me personally, I don't want to stick to stereotypes, but we have to admit that we have biases, both unconscious and conscious biases that we might have against different sectors of society, and stereotypes that may well still exist. So I think it's worth mentioning it. Sometimes when I've worked with women as well, for example, I was working with someone who was in a medical team and finding it difficult to be heard, to be listened to. So we worked on her assertiveness, but also there was some level of microaggressions coming in where she was being spoken over. So we agreed a way in which she could have a conversation with the individual, which we should do as responsible adults who are motivated and being the pilots of our career, not the passengers. But that person addressed it, but also worked on her own assertiveness. And sometimes as well, I think when women go into leadership, I quite often hear from my clients that they feel they're being held to higher standards, perhaps. And some of these might feel old fashioned and very traditional. We know that gender is a very personal and individual thing, but those are just some of the nuances that I've heard about on my travels with my clients. So how do we define imposter syndrome? So I've given you three different definitions here. As far as I'm aware, it's not been diagnosed as a psychological condition, but it is something that happens. There's no medical diagnosis for it as such. However, if we do leave it unchecked, it can lead to stress, burnout, anxiety. So we do have to recognise it and recognise when it's happening for us and be able to adapt and adjust to it. So you can have imposter thoughts, imposter cycle, or imposter syndrome. So you've got a choice of three. Lucky you. Imposter thoughts, we might get them now and again. They just buzz in and out of our mind. Sort of, I'm questioning myself. I've got some awareness that perhaps I'm not sure how to do this. Or we might have a cycle where we go into over preparation or procrastination even because we're doubting ourselves, and that might lead to doing something in a frenzied rush. Or we might actually have imposter syndrome stroke phenomenon, which is something that's more persistent. Now, if any of these feel familiar to you or sound familiar to you, that self-doubt that might be intermittent, creeping, or persistent, then just put a yes in the box. And again, at the end of the webinar, at the end of the workshop, I'll share with you a link to book a call so that you can really diagnose your own particular style or flavour of imposter syndrome, because I don't want to put everybody in the same bucket. We're all having a unique experience. So here's some nuances for you. So how do we recognise it? It can be a building feeling, sort of something gnawing at you, because some of us are very aware of imposter syndrome. It's a term we use a lot today. And let's face it, if people like J-Lo, Jennifer Garner, all these amazing actresses, they don't all have to be called Jennifer, by the way, they were just the two I could think of. If successful people feel that, Zendaya, for example, talked about when she was getting more successful, a brilliant actress, but she felt that she had imposter syndrome, so it's quite well known. And sometimes it might not feel like that for you. It might just feel, it might feel as though you're hesitating, you're over preparing, you might be procrastinating because you're scared of getting it wrong. So it's very individual. So these are some of the ways in which you might start to recognize it. It's not comprehensive, but it's a starter for 10. Yep. We've got some yeses in the box there. Absolutely. You're not alone. The good news is you're not alone. The bad news is you're not alone, because I've already talked about that 70% of people may well deal with imposter syndrome every year. However, there are ways to deal with it. So I've given you here some signs, both psychological, mental, but also physical, where you might recognize that I am feeling like I don't belong. I'm an imposter. So let me just move my slides along. Whoops. Let's just go back. Sorry, this has been a bit slow today. Must be the cold weather. And here we go. So let's try and put this in context. What can this feel like? What could this sound like? It might be that you feel your success is entirely dependent on external events. For example, I only got this job or this promotion because there was a restructure. I only got this role because nobody else wanted to do it. There was nobody else available. I'm not sure what to do. I used to know, particularly if you're a manager taking that step into leadership, technically, I knew how to do my job. But now I've moved into a leadership position, I'm not sure how to do my job anymore. I'm having some self doubt. I think self doubt and imposter syndrome go hand in hand. And we sort of blame external events for our success. We don't recognize the attributes and the work we've put in to get where we are. It can feel anxious thoughts. It can feel negative. We can feel that we have negative self-talk, such as I don't, I can't, I'm not sure. Anything with not, can't, not sure is usually a sign of imposter syndrome. We may feel inadequate and we may feel, oh, this is all a mistake. This is an accident and I'm going to get found out. If that sounds familiar, put a yes in the chat. If it's something else, feel free to share what that is. I won't say your name, don't worry, it's all confidential, but I'd love to know what it feels like, what it sounds like, what it looks like to you. These are just some of the examples I could think of and I've spoken about with my clients. I'm doubting myself and my abilities. My success is down to everything out there, nothing to do with what I've built for myself and the efforts that I've made. Sometimes it may feel like I don't belong. If you're working in a project work stream, for example, which I have in the past, I spent many years in pharmaceuticals, and when we were working on discovery and commercializing treatments, we'd be working with different people, different departments. And sometimes each department and function has its own language, and that can feel very unfamiliar. And the pace and the way in which different departments work can feel very unfamiliar. And it can feel quite challenging to hold your own in those project work streams, to meet in the middle, to understand what's going on. So sometimes I've seen that before. I worked with a director who was a senior global director in, actually it was construction. This example's from construction. Hugely successful, had a career in the military, very high ranking, moved into the commercial world, the private sector, and questioned himself. It feels like you're questioning yourself, as in, well, I did this before, I was recognized for it, and it worked really, really well. But something tells me this isn't going to work here. It might be that you have a boss that has a very different style. You have teams which have a very different style. It may be you've had a few conflicts that you've not had before. And particularly if you're moving from manager to leader, that can feel very, very challenging. You might be working with people who you haven't managed before. They used to be your peers. They used to be on your level. And now you've got to recalibrate those relationships to become a leader. So this is also very common, particularly if you're a manager. Some of the ways in which I've seen people trying to deal with imposter syndrome are here. Sometimes we might over-prepare. We might work really, really hard because we're doubting ourselves. And I'll share a personal example of that in a moment. Because we feel we have this self-doubt, these nagging thoughts or these persistent thoughts, we might go the extra mile, burn the midnight oil and work really, really hard. We might ignore those feelings and thoughts and think, well, if I just power through it, it will be fine. We might go into ourselves, hide away a bit, perhaps not be as vocal in meetings or calls. We might even try to get a new job because it's persistent and it just feels uncomfortable, but we don't really understand what's going on. Perhaps we've not heard of imposter syndrome, because sometimes, you know, who wakes up in the morning and says, today, I think I've got imposter syndrome? You might do, but you might just have this building feeling. So some people try and get a new job, but that with that might come some new issues and the persistent issues you haven't dealt with before. And as a reminder, it's very, very common. We might try and read a book, an article to help us, but it won't deal with our specific situation. And as I mentioned before, it leads to stress, burnout, anxiety. We all have anxious thoughts at times, and those have their place in terms of motivating us, helping us to get organized. But if it's persistent, it's something we really, really need to look at. And if left unchecked, it can lead into feeling depressed, etc. So we do want to deal with it. We might try our typical approach. Perhaps we have a certain style of leadership or management. If I'm just happy and friendly to everyone, that will work. Unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't, because people in our team or people we work with have very different styles, and it might lead you to doubt yourself. Again, manager to leader. Technically, I was great at my job as a manager, and you still are. But this leadership position, what does this mean? So here are some of the causes. A new team restructure, I've covered some of those already. Societal expectations, I mentioned that at the beginning, such as gender, community experiences, community expectations. I've worked with people from across many different communities, and there is that peer pressure or unspoken pressure to conform to a particular way of living your life or going about your career, and that can put on a lot of pressure. And if you're trying to fit in there, but you're having to adopt different traits here, for example, becoming more assertive, becoming more challenging, becoming more questioning, having to speak up more, but your societal community doesn't reward or recognize that, that can feel very, very jarring. We can compare ourselves to other people. Let's not do it. Just catch yourself doing it and say, hang on a minute, I'm my own person, I have my own strengths. Negative self-talk. If you have a preponderance towards speaking about yourself negatively, this can actually also lead to imposter syndrome. Other external factors, education, our educational experiences. Perhaps we had teachers that weren't very supportive. Perhaps we had a family upbringing that was quite challenging. Perhaps we grew up in a very high pressure environment. Perhaps we grew up in a very high pressure educational environment, cultural norms, as I've mentioned. And then we have personality styles. I use DISC profiling to diagnose exactly the leadership style for my clients and also their teams. We have a team dashboard. And if you'd like to learn more about that, then feel free to book a call with me. I will share a link at the end. It's really super important. We must understand ourselves to be able to lead others. And sometimes when there's conflicts or differences, and yet what we did before worked, it can be challenging. And when you're a manager, and you've gone into leadership, psychologically, there's a different contract with the people you're working with and the relationships you have with them and how you conduct yourself. So it's really important we recognize that and recognize that change. So I'm just going to share a quick story. I've been coaching for about 8 or 9 years now. I've worked with many, many different companies. I'm a coach for the Healthcare Business Women's Association. I've worked with companies in technology, NTT data. I've worked in construction. I've worked with L'Oreal. I've worked with pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, Merck, GSK, lots of fantastic companies. And I've worked with executives at all different levels of the organization. Prior to that, I had a 25-year career up to board level in firstly supply chain and logistics and then pharmaceuticals. Now, when I was 30, quite a while ago, I was the first woman on a board, and actually I didn't feel like an imposter there because the culture, I don't know, I just felt I belonged. It suited my personality, very dynamic, very customer focused, very open, and the CEO set that tone and it worked really well for me. So strangely enough, I didn't feel like an imposter then. Fast forward a few years and I moved from private sector into public sector. And that's when I felt, I didn't even call it imposter syndrome because I didn't know what it was. I just felt out of sorts, uncomfortable. And it was because the culture was so different for me. And I realized that what had made me successful up until this point, my leadership style, my management style, I had this underlying feeling that it needed to change. And it did need to change because of the various ways of working in the NHS, and one wasn't better than the other. There's no criticism. It was different. And what I did is what I tend to do. I worked harder. I burnt the midnight oil. I carried work for my teams because I didn't want to burden them. And that really did cost me my exercise routines. It cost me time with people that I cared about. And it cost me a bit of sleep because I was getting up so early to work harder to try and deal with it. So I don't recommend that. Now, imposter syndrome. Who's been through some change lately? Give me a thumbs up or put a yes in the chat. And if you haven't, well, this year's been very, very challenging. So we've got some comments here in the chat. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a funny old year. There's been lots of changes. So I did want to touch on this because this graph, you may have heard of it. This is a classic change model example. It's the various emotions that we go through during change. And some of these you might recognize. We go all the way through shock, whatever the change is. It might even be a positive change. These are some of the different, I guess, timestamps in the curve. And sometimes we can go round and round in a circle if we haven't been helped by our leadership team, or we haven't really managed to work our way through the change. So I wanted to touch on this because this is also aligned to when imposter syndrome can creep in. Not always, but sometimes. So it's important to recognize and think, well, hang on a minute. Am I going through some kind of change? Now, this could be a work change. It could be a personal change. So we can have imposter syndrome in our personal lives and our professional lives. So let me just move the slides along. So it's important to recognize this. It's a really great graph to have in general to recognize, I might be going through some of these feelings. Now then, you're welcome, everyone. There's more than one different type of imposter. Oh yes, there's about 5. And I've put them on a graphic here. There are 5 different types of imposter syndrome. And when I'm working with my clients, I work very carefully to understand what's your specific type of imposter at this point in time. Now, I've worked with clients where they have a blend of a couple of imposter syndromes. I was working with somebody, a very high level manager in finance, who had perfectionist traits, but also the soloist traits. Now, that meant for her, she wasn't asking for help. She perhaps needed to work more on delegation, taking that journey from management to leadership, inheriting new projects like ESG. So these are 5 different types of imposter. And it's really, really important that we don't just label everything as imposter syndrome or whatever that feels like for you. Self-doubt, loss of confidence, hesitance, procrastination, working too hard, burning the midnight oil, whatever it looks like, there will be some flavour of imposter syndrome that resonates with you. So if there's one that resonates with you or 2, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. And this is what I work through with my clients to make sure we are tackling the right type of imposter and the right challenges, because one person's challenges will not be same as the other person's challenges. I coach hundreds, if not more, people each year, and every situation is unique. Now, what does this mean? Okay, so if we embrace imposter syndrome, it can be a real strength of growth and development like nothing you've ever believed. But what I don't want you to do is to go through months of anxious thoughts, of self-doubt, of doubting yourself, of losing your confidence, because confidence can be gained, but it can also drop if we don't learn to deal with it. I want you to be successful in your career. I want you to be that forward-thinking leader or manager that's really navigating their own career, and you're not prey to the outside conditions, the weather outside. I want you to be the pilot, not the passenger of your own career, and own your strengths and really look at areas for growth. And when I talked about friend or foe, how are you going to look at this? What frame of reference are you going to use? Yes, it might be scary. It might be unsettling. It might be very alien to you, but just sit with it for a minute because it can be the biggest source of growth you've had in your life, both personally and professionally. And I would argue that we can choose to see our imposter syndrome as a friend. Now, your imposter voice or these self doubt talks, they might sound a bit harsh, they might sound a bit angry, but try and visualize it in a different way. Try and think about it as a friend that's got a message for you. Now, some of the approaches that we take can be, as I've mentioned before, I've talked about some of the different ways in which people deal with it. We can fight against it, keep going, keep going, keep going. We might run away from it, hide. If I just work a bit harder, this will be fine. If I just get everybody to like me, this will be fine. Nothing wrong with being liked, but actually sometimes when you're managing and leading, taking that jump to manager to leader, we need to learn how to lead people effectively. You might freeze. It might be that things are taking you twice as long to do. And I just want you to know this won't last forever. As long as you tackle it and really lean into your specific type of imposter and understand it, you will really, really grow. And I really recommend you book a call to talk through how your imposter syndrome is showing up for you. It's a signal to change or to grow. What do I need to do differently? And I'd like you to use another frame of reference. Feelings. Oh, we're talking about feelings. Yes. I'd like you to think about these feelings as information, as messages, because that's what feelings are. They can feel very complex. They can feel very confusing. They can feel very overwhelming. But if we can just stay still, sit with it for a moment, and neutralize it and think about, well, what's at the bottom of this? What is really bothering me? What am I concerned about? You can look at doing a skills audit. Do a skills audit and think about, well, okay, these are my strengths. This is why I got this job. This is what I've been told about why I got this job. This is why I've been successful so far. Have a look at it and think, well, where could there be some missing bits? So use feelings as information. And if this is for your team, make sure that you, or whether it's your team, have somebody to talk to and the right development in place to take this leap forward, because it will be a fantastic leap forward for you to really embrace it and learn about your own style, your own approaches, your own stressors. And sometimes when we try and ignore something, it just gets bigger and bigger. And if that sounds familiar, just whack yes in the chat. I find that. So how do I deal with it with my clients? I break it down into 3 very clear steps: diagnose, plan, and grow. And it might feel like you've got this internal conflict going on. It feels conflicting. On the one hand, you really want to progress, but something's holding you back. So how do we deal with this internal conflict? These are the 3 key steps. And this is what I've worked on with my clients, and I've got a case study to share with you. We diagnose it. I talked about how we must understand your specific case and patterns. We must understand what you've been trying to do to deal with it. Remember that I said that I spent a lot of time burning the midnight oil, working really hard, not sleeping properly. I don't want that for you. Let's nip it in the bud and understand how you typically react to these kinds of situations. Let's identify your imposter. Let's identify the stressors, and then we convert these stressors. Because what stresses me out might not be the same as what stresses you out. So, for example, I like speaking on the stage. For some people, they would hate it and find it terribly stressful. Now, do I think about what I'm going to say? Do I get maybe a little bit nervous or think about what I'm going to be presenting? Of course I do. But for me, that's positive stress. But for other people, it might be something more negative, as in, oh, I could never do that. And actually, a lot of managers to leaders that I work with, and even a lot of accomplished leaders, really struggle with this. And again, another area where imposter syndrome can really creep in. We're going to have a look at your baseline leadership style. I have a number of psychologically backed tools and resources I can share with you, and we're going to dive into what's your unique approach to leadership. What are the typical strengths you use? Where are the areas for growth? What kind of leader are you? What kind of manager are you? And then we're going to identify your baseline style that you tend to rely upon and how we can flex it and grow. And this will uncover, again, some of the areas where, this could be how you're dealing with imposter syndrome. It could be you have a style that lends itself to perfectionism. You want to do everything in great detail. But when you inherit perhaps or move into a role with a bigger team or a different team, you can't do everything to 200%. The perfectionism maybe needs to be adjusted into delegation, into, 80% is actually okay in most cases. And I've worked with a lot of people in this area where we just use that report to check in and think about where we need to adapt and adjust when we're in that leadership position. I also have profiles for teams that I can use and team dashboards. So if you want to get a temperature check of what's happening across your team, that's something we can definitely do together. So we'll look at past feedback. And in some cases, depending on the program, I often speak in confidence to other members of the team to get that 360-degree feedback. We then break it down into a plan, and that works in a way in terms of when you're available and the time frame that works for you, that suits you, because I have clients from all around the world who have very busy schedules. So we create a plan that's going to work for you or your team. There are group programs, individual programs, there are intensive VIP days that I can pull together to tackle this, but we create a very specific plan to you. If you're working in a team, we create a team map and a team dashboard. If there's a few of you that are feeling a bit doubtful, out of sorts, or if it's somebody in your team, we can look at that team dashboard to see where there are some really, really great strengths within the team and where perhaps the team needs to operate a bit more efficiently. We monitor the plan. And when you're working with me, if we use materials, which I quite often provide, you'll have those materials for life. But we break it down and we work in a way that works for you. Now, for some people, it's days. For some people, a couple of months, a few months. A group program, they're very, very unique depending on the group. But we go at a pace that works for you to make sure you're able to assimilate the changes, let it sink in. If you're somebody that's quite reflected, to reflect, and we break down based on what we've diagnosed the specific areas we need to focus on to help you quash the imposter syndrome, to look at it as a friend that's going to help you on your leadership and career journey. And you will grow. It's amazing sometimes the changes that I see in people. I was working with someone in pharma who had recently been made redundant after years, decades at a pharmaceutical company that felt like family. And he just looked he wasn't the man that I knew before when I was working in pharma. He looked discouraged, he looked unhappy, the body language like this, the face like this, looking tired. Within a few sessions, it looked like, I don't know, it looked like he'd had a glow up. He looked completely different, really bubbly, enthusiastic, positive, motivated, because we went into his diagnosis. We looked at his strengths. We looked at these areas that were really, really bothering him and realizing that it doesn't mean that everything you've done is wrong. This is just a change and an adaptation. And within a couple of months, he was in an even better role in a different pharmaceutical company, where he is today, going from strength to strength and working on the career path that we had talked about, which is lovely to see. I really enjoy seeing the progress of my clients. And he felt like an imposter at times because it was, well, what was that all about? That change. I've been there for years and now I'm going into a different role. So we worked through it during his journey because it kept coming up. So you will grow, you will have guides, you will have materials. There's different ways I can work with you, as I've mentioned, and you will grow 100%. I've seen it physically and I've seen it in the way that my clients talk, what they tell me about their progress. Here's another case study for you. So again, in biopharma, I do work across a range of sectors. And if any of these sound familiar to you, or you have a unique situation that's bothering you, then just drop a note in the chat or DM me to book a call and we can talk about your specific situation. But I do like to share case studies. I was working with a global director in biopharma, and this person had acquired a much bigger team. But she was inheriting a team that had a leader that was very, very popular, or that was her perception. How can I step into that person's shoes? How can I be as good as that person? Comparing. Do you remember what I said about comparing? That we should try and avoid that. When we catch ourselves doing it, let's avoid it. Let's switch that thought into something else. Is it, maybe I need to have a new skill to learn. Maybe there's a new skill I need to learn. And there was lots of self-doubts, fears, wasn't sure what to do. Very, very accomplished leaders. Imposter syndrome does not recognise where you sit on an org chart or the level of seniority or the kind of job that you do or the kind of career that you have or what's going on in your personal life. It can happen at any time and it can reoccur. But when it reoccurs, you'll recognise it and be able to deal with it based on that diagnose, plan and grow methodology I shared with you. So she was incredibly successful, but all of a sudden started having these doubts and thoughts. So we worked together for 3 months to get her through the 30, 60, 90-day plan approach, breaking down goals. We diagnosed a specific way she was leading the team. I have a specific report which diagnoses how you lead a team, one to many. And we looked at her uniqueness. And as we went on the journey, we realised, well, actually, the former leader, while she was very good, she wasn't as popular as she'd thought. So remember I said about thoughts and feelings being information? She built it up in her head over time. So we went through diagnose, plan and grow, and these were the results at the end. And she had just slotted into the reporting into the C-suite. She's been picked out as somebody that has a style of leadership that team needs. So 2 months before that, doubting herself, fast forward 2 months to being a valued asset of the team, to being included on strategic projects that she was interested in, learning how to influence upwards. So she had this tremendous growth and she's enjoying her role. She's got the recognition internally. She's stopped holding herself back from the things she needed to do, such as succession planning, talent development, restructuring the team, all in an ethical way so she doesn't lose herself. But it was all built up in her mind and we just had to break it down bit by bit. So that's why I break it down into the 3 steps. Here's a few words from happy clients in the past. So just demonstrating here, I've got lots of testimonials on my website, on LinkedIn. Please feel free to have a look. And any past posts that I've done on imposter syndrome. I've got blogs on my website as well. If you tap in imposter syndrome, there's plenty of blogs in there about imposter syndrome, past webinars that I've done, and there's also a link to book a call to discuss your unique situation. Now, let's remind ourselves where we started our journey together. Ignoring it won't work. Working harder doesn't work. Those are some of the areas that I've seen, the ways in which people trying to deal with imposter syndrome. And unfortunately, they don't tend to work. And sometimes I work with people who have tried this approach And I've tried it to a certain extent. I've been very open and candid with you about how I approached it in the past until I went, hello, McFly, you need to do something different. Sorry, that's a quote from Back to the Future. If you recognise Back to the Future, if you do, put a yes in the chat. I like to use that phrase. I've worked with people who have tried this, and what's happened is they haven't had the career success that they wanted or the promotion. So I'd rather you recognise it now and recognise there are actions that we choose not to take that may not be very effective. But the effective way is to deal with it and really decide, actually, this is my life, my experience, my career. I want to be happy. I want to be healthy. So how do I deal with these thoughts, these nagging thoughts? The one size fits all style of leadership or management won't work either. We need to learn how to flex and adapt. And imposter syndrome gives us a chance to do that. You might have an experience where I've always got on with everybody in work streams or projects before. I've always got on very well with everybody in my team, but then the team changes or you move into a new role. And that's no longer the case. And we're very hard on ourselves, aren't we? We blame ourselves too much. And sometimes that's about how our brains work, because the human brain is somewhat wired towards negativity because of our evolution and the need to survive. But we don't need to think like that anymore. We don't need to try and sort of hide or freeze or procrastinate or use one size fits all. That worked before, will it work again? That style of leadership, I might need to grow, I might need to adapt. So we really need to look at our own mindsets, limiting beliefs, the things that we say to ourselves that aren't very empowering, and we need to empower ourselves. And believe you me, when I've worked with people on imposter syndrome, it's helped them with influence, career opportunities, leadership growth and happiness, work-life balance, team motivation. And it's actually also helped their private life as well, because sometimes, and actually studies show this, I can't quote the study, but studies show that when we have issues in our career, guess what? Trips over into our personal life. And it can work the other way around. So if you work with me, I'm going to improve your marriage as well, or your relationship. So, which actually somebody did say that to me once. I've had that a couple of times actually. But these are some of the benefits if we decide to take a different path forward. And I believe that if you're on this webinar today, you're somebody that is forward thinking, motivated, and wants to have a happy, healthy career. We all deserve that. So some other techniques. I promised some techniques. I've given you a few ideas along the way about not comparing, about how to see feelings as information. What I'd like you to do is start really counting your achievements. Put it on your iPhone or your Android, write it down, scribble it on a piece of paper, write down everything you've achieved, personally and professionally. Go for it, because I'm sure there's going to be a huge, massive list. Those challenges that you've overcome. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be big. It can be anything. Count everything you've achieved, courses, promotions, career progressions. I don't know, getting over something that was really big in your personal life. Think about this. Is this a feeling or is it fact? If you get these nagging doubts and these nagging thoughts, these perpetual thoughts, you can try to think about it as, well, hang on a minute, what is this feeling? What's it telling me? What's the message? Is this fact? Or is this something I'm choosing to believe about myself? And I think you'll get a different lens on your current situations. Flip the script. If you hear anything saying, oh, I can't do this, I won't do this, I don't fit in, just flip it. Go, hang on, I'm noticing this. Let's flip the script. I'm going to learn how to do it. I'm going to move forward. I want to grow. So choose a more empowering thought, and we can tell if we listen to our bodies what feels empowering and what doesn't. I'm sure you've all been there, but this doesn't feel very empowering. But hang on, pull my shoulders back, sit up straight. Sound like a teacher. Then that can feel very, very empowering. And it just fills us with these feel-good hormones, because even though it's challenging, we're facing up to our challenges, and that will help build your resilience. As you go in through your career, as you expand, as you learn, as you grow, your resilience will grow and grow. The ability to bounce back from challenging situations. Amplify the positive. Remember, I said that brains sometimes think negatively on the whole. Amplify the positive. Self-talk. Have a look at it. But have a look at your developmental needs. Reframe all the failures and mistakes. We've all had them. We've all had setbacks. But reframe it as something that you needed to learn or wanted to learn, or if it was a business you were running, that, look, it was a difficult time for the economy, something like that. Reframe anything you feel is a failure. Let's not put everything on ourselves, because there's a big whole wide world out there, and we can't possibly control much of it. Just ourselves and a few people around us. Perhaps we can influence people around us, but really the only thing we have control or mastery over is ourselves. Have a look at mentoring and coaching. I've shown you how I break down my programs to make it more manageable for people, not so overwhelming as you go through a process, and use visualization. Our brain's like a mind movie, so play yourself a mental movie of seeing yourself speaking very well, very eloquently in front of a leadership team, and our brains basically believe what we tell it. So this could be your greatest opportunity yet to grow. The growth I see with my clients when they thought the imposter syndrome was a foe, but then embraced it and thought, hang on, let's grow, let's change. And maybe you're at the point of, I just can't carry on like this anymore. Then this is going to be one of the greatest opportunities yet to learn, to grow, to be a better leader, to be a better member of your organizational communities, you name it. Now, I've got some availabilities for some calls. We're getting near to the end of the year, but I've got about 15 spaces. There's a link there and a QR code if you'd like to book a call. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'll be sending you the recording and a free checklist about some of these internal conflicts that are going on and how you can overcome imposter syndrome. It's a guidebook that will talk about some of those conflicts you're facing and some of the areas I've talked about today in a little bit more detail. But as I mentioned, diagnose, plan, grow. We need sometimes someone to reflect. And my job is not to give you ill-founded advice based on my experiences. My job is to understand your unique situation and help you work through it much faster than if you're sitting there trying to figure it out on our own, because we can't see inside our own heads, let alone, well, we can see the end of our nose just about. So book a call, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you, and I'm wishing you all the success for the future. So look out for the checklists, the guide, and the recording. Thanks for joining today.